Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus A330 pilot, and in today's video I want to analyze what might have happened on the recent Edelweiss A340 takeoff that went viral on the internet. So let's start first of all by having a look at what actually happened and what we know by now. So we got a lovely article on the Aviation Herald here, which I'm going to link in the video description below. At this point, just a quick thank you very much to the Aviation Herald for your continued excellent reporting on aviation. Now, what happened? An Edelweiss A340-300 taking off from Zurich's runway 16 rotated for takeoff and became airborne, but then sank back to the runway, nearly touching the ground at the end of the runway before finally being able to climb out to safety. Now, there is a lovely video on that takeoff from spotter and aviation YouTuber Zurich Aviation Channel, which I'm going to link in the video description below, who caught the takeoff on camera. So let's have a close look at what has happened over here, and then we will go over why it might have happened and what might have happened in the aftermath. And I will also go over a couple of the common theories that we see by aviation enthusiasts covering this incident on the internet. So let's first of all have a look into what exactly happened and what it looked like. So we've got our A340 accelerating down the runway, rotating here at a normal rotation rate, and then it just stuck in that position for a little while before eventually becoming airborne very slowly. Shortly after becoming airborne, the pilots are lowering the nose a little bit and the airplane starts descending back down to the runway before the nose is eventually being pulled up again and the airplane slowly climbs out to safety. So this is pretty much what has happened in this incident. So the spectacular thing, of course, being that the airplane just descends back down to the runway here and almost touches the runway again. It might even have touched it with the left aft wheel over here before then becoming airborne again. Now, the Aviation Herald reports that after becoming airborne, the crew reported that they had a tailwind on rotation, and according to preliminary information, an investigation has been opened into the departure. A tailwind gust is being suspected. Now, the internet wouldn't be the internet if you didn't have comments like these popping up straight away, like, very dangerous, this machine was not ready to fly, or crew will probably be suspended. So, lots of nonsense there going on the internet, but let's deal with the actual facts. So, what we know is that what the pilots reported, and that is that they had a tailwind on rotation and a tailwind gust is being suspected. Now, the Aviation Herald also gives us some of the general weather conditions of the time. So we can see down here the airplane took off at 11:04 UTC, so just in between those two metas over here. At 10:50 they reported the wind 250 at 3, variable between 200 and 300 degrees, and then at 11:20 they reported the wind variable 4 knots and cavalcade conditions. So if we now have a look into the video once more, with that background, we can kind of analyze what exactly happens there. So we first of all observe the airplane rotating, and the rotation rate and speed is pretty much normal, about 3 degrees per second for the aircraft type in question. Now 2.5 degrees to be exact on the A340. Now the plane then kind of sticks in the attitude that we have over here, as you can see, before it eventually gets airborne. Now let's first of all talk about the attitude that we see. Now this is roughly when the front part of the bogie gets airborne over here. The aft part of the bogie is still on the ground. So this is pretty much the minimum tail clearance that we see over here. Now if you take a door up here, which is roughly 2 meters in height, and then compare it with the height of the airplane's tail above the runway, then we can see that we've got roughly 1 meter tail clearance over here. And that 1 meter is actually normal for the A340-300. So what we see to this point is pretty much normal, with the exception that the plane remained on the ground for a little bit longer before eventually becoming airborne. Now, why is that? Well, if we have a look into this again, we can see that we are looking at about approximately 2, maybe 3 seconds before the airplane starts climbing. Now, this very much fits with a point at which a tailwind gust might hit. If we go back to the meta and look at this, wind variable 4 knots, And then also have a look at the clues about the actual wind on takeoff that we can find in the video. Most namely, have a look at the windsock that you see in the picture right over here. Then we can actually see a tailwind component that's being indicated on the windsock. So what probably happened is during the rotation, a probable headwind of 4 knots that we might have had previously changed into a tailwind of 4 knots, and thus the airplane might have lost approximately 8 knots of airspeed. If you now remember the takeoff on the A340 that we have over here from just planes, let's have a look into how much the A340 accelerates during a normal takeoff condition. Let's have a look at that.
Rotate.
So now the nose comes up, and now have a look at the trend vector and at the acceleration over here. As you can see, it doesn't really accelerate very much. The trend vector was showing roughly 10 knots. That means the airplane is going to accelerate 10 knots in about 5 seconds. So if we're looking at that acceleration and then think of a sudden tailwind gust, or let's say 4 knots of headwind shifting into 4 knots of tailwind, that means we are losing 8 knots. So this can be, under normal circumstances, approximately 4 seconds of acceleration that we're losing here. But we now have to keep the following phenomenon in sight. Look at the airplane, how it is lifting off and now basically paralleling the runway. In these conditions, the plane is moving here, like that. But the cross-section of the plane that is causing drag is looking like this. So you've got a condition where you have a lot of drag, but rather little excess thrust available. So this now means that the airplane can barely accelerate at all anymore, and if the pilots would keep the airplane in this condition, it might have so much drag that it might not become airborne and climb away safely at all. Therefore, the pilot's reaction now is completely correct. They push the nose down in order to reduce the airplane's cross-section, pick up speed, and overcome the tailwind that they might have encountered. Now, the internet had quite a lot of comments that the pilots might have rotated the airplane too early, or have done incorrect takeoff calculations. Now, there is nothing pointing to incorrect takeoff calculations over here, but there is a little bit of truth into having rotated the airplane too early. Now, obviously, we are not talking about too early in terms of a pilot mistake, but when taking into account that the wind might have changed from a head into a tailwind, the speed might have decreased by, let's just say, 8 knots. We do have to add the disclaimer here that those meta speeds are obviously just mean speeds that are observed before the meta publication, so it might have been more at this very second where the airplane started to rotate. They might have lost more speed than just 8 knots, so this is just speculation here about how much they might actually have lost, and pretty sure by now the airline will have secured the data from the flight data recorder and will have gone into an investigation of what exactly happened there. So let's just assume that they lost 8 knots of speed. It might have been more, it might have been a little bit less, it might even just have been 5 knots, but by the time you rotate the plane, by the time you build up that drag from the plane still moving forward with that great cross-section of the nose being up, basically doing a wheelie, that obviously might kill off the additional thrust you have available and therefore stop the acceleration. Therefore, the pilot's reaction, pushing the nose down again, is completely correct in order to start accelerating through that critical speed and now get back airborne again. In fact, this is exactly what the flight crew technique manual suggests you to do. So when you lose speed on the takeoff, you stop the rotation at the point where you are. In this case, they might have stopped at roughly the liftoff attitude, but depending on where the gust have hit, that might have been exactly what they had. So the pilot's reaction here, completely correct. Take the nose down again, accelerate again, and now obviously everyone is like, oh, but the airplane almost touched down again. Yes, that doesn't matter at all. What matters is that you accelerate the plane, and if you touch the runway with that, who cares? The landing gear is not in the process of being retracted here, because the pilots could not observe a positive rate of climb, so the landing gear stays extended. They might have touched the runway again for a short moment, and that's it. Now, the theory of a tailwind gust is actually being supported by the very profile that the airplane takes in these moments. Let's have a look at those couple of seconds again. So, we can see the nose is being pushed down, and now the nose is being risen rather aggressively here. We can only speculate whether the pilots wanted to avoid contact with the runway, or whether the tailwind gust might have just been over again, so they had their speed again and therefore just wanted to get back into a climb. Both is possible, both would be legit reasons for the profile that we see the airplane flying over here. And as you can see, now that the airplane gets the nose back up again, it starts a normal climb. So that kind of suggests that they have at this point picked the speed up again that the airplane has lost during that little tailwind gust and are now climbing away safely again. In order to support the theory, I have actually asked a pilot who is based in Zurich if he could tell me something about the conditions of taking off on runway 16 in general. And his answer was basically that Zurich is a little bit of a strange airfield. The runway configuration is basically being chosen based on political demands rather than meteorological demands. So the runways in use might very well have a tailwind that is known and being accepted because of noise abatement reasons and because they want to avoid aircraft overflying certain areas at a low altitude, and therefore the runway configuration is primarily chosen based on these political demands. Now, this in turn means that whenever they are taking off in Zurich, they basically always calculate, or not always, but often calculate a certain tailwind, even though none might be reported. So if we have a look at the weather conditions being reported over here, basically, personally, I would have just calculated 5 knots of tailwind, and that's it. But we now have to understand what that takeoff tailwind calculation means. Basically, when takeoff data is being calculated, the performance software is going to take into account 50% of the headwind that you enter, to be conservative, or 150% of the tailwind you enter. So if you calculate 5 knots of tailwind, your performance is being calculated for 7.5 knots of tailwind, actually. Now, this is just in order to add a certain safety factor in, because the aviation world understands that wind readings are never entirely accurate, but they're only accurate for the point where the actual instruments measuring the wind are located, and that is usually on a 10 meters high tower somewhere next to the runway. But remember, the runway is long. In case of runway 16 at Zurich, it is actually 3,700 meters long, as we can see on the chart over here. So the wind might be correct for a reading somewhere down here, but it might not be correct for what is actually the case right over here. So different wind values across the entire runway are completely normal in the aviation world, and therefore are what you can actually expect, and therefore the takeoff calculation is being adjusted for that. But what the takeoff calculation does not take into account, even if you do calculate a tailwind takeoff, is that a certain gust might happen. So let's say that we are taking off as we should, and now we do receive that little gust. Now, what happens then is that our performance is temporarily degraded while the airplane is flying through the gust, and that is exactly what we see on this takeoff. So we see the airplane rotating. My guess is that somewhere at this point the gust happens. Now the airplane takes off with a speed slower than what you're supposed to have. Therefore the pilots are lowering the nose, gaining that speed again, and as soon as the speed is back up, they rotate the plane back into a normal liftoff attitude and then take it into the air. So that is exactly what pilots are supposed to do in these conditions, and it is not like what a user wrote there, very dangerous. Now, something that we can also have a look at is the position of the airplane down the runway when the incident happens. There are quite a couple of comments over the internet saying that the airplane almost runs out of runway, and that is not the case at all. But let's start with a little bit of a background into the performance of the A330 and A340 aircraft on takeoff. I'm generalizing here between the 330 and 340 because they are designed in a similar way, and obviously while different laws apply to taking off with 5 APUs than with 2 engines, nonetheless we end up with basically the same amount or the same behavior of the aircraft. So obviously you try to reduce the temperature in the engines as much as possible in order to extend the engine life. This is what is basically done by applying a flex temperature on your takeoff. So On these aircraft, you basically use most of the runway you have available. If you need to abort the takeoff by the time that you pass V1, you will basically end up more or less using the entire runway. That is how far you derate those engines. So if we have a look over here, we are starting the rotation just about now, which is roughly at the intersection between runway 16 and runway 28 down here in Zurich. So having a look into the general profile, we got a 3,700 meter runway. We start to rotate at roughly, let's call it about 3/5 down the runway, 60% the runway length. So we're looking at approximately 1,800 meters of runway. Now, it is fair to assume that V1 would have been just prior to that, so V1 reached approximately halfway down the field. If you reject the takeoff then, we're talking normal takeoff speeds here, about 160 knots, where you start to rotate, maybe 150 for V1. If you reject the takeoff then, the plane would just about stop towards the end of the stopway of the runway down here. So, looking into this scenario now, if we pass V1, we have an engine failure, then the airplane is designed to cross the end of the runway at 35 feet. In wet conditions, that can even be lowered to 15 feet. So, seeing that we don't have an engine failure over here, but following along this takeoff, we are looking at the airplane getting airborne about, well, just into the touchdown zone of the opposite. So we're looking at about maybe 2,500 meters-ish of runway. And then the airplane gets airborne, and you can see that it almost touches down right on the aiming point of the opposite runway over here. So now we're looking at the distance of the displaced runway threshold plus the distance to the aiming point. So when we look at the general chart of the runway over here, we can see a little bit of performance theory here. If we look into the chart, runway 16 has a takeoff run available of 3,700 meters from the full length, which is safe to be assumed that they used this. And then if we look into the opposite runway, in runway 34, we're also looking at 3,700 meters, but there is a displaced threshold on that one. So if we now have a look into some more information, we can see that on the opposite runway, on runway 34, you're just about looking at a landing run available of 3,270. So we can say that we've got 3,270 meters. Then we have, due to a 60 meters wide runway, 450 meters to the typical aiming point. So we're looking at a distance towards the end of the runway of roughly 700 meters at the point where the airplane almost touches the ground again. But then we can see it is getting airborne again and overflying the display threshold, which is basically now, as we can see by the shadow of the plane, seeing that this is approximately 1 o'clock p.m. local time. It's safe to say that the shadow will be located almost below the airplane. So now overflying the end of the runway, we already have those 35 feet, and we still have the stopway available over here. So by the time the airplane actually overflies the end of the runway, which is more or less now, we can see we've got more than the actual wingspan of the plane, so we are looking at more than 60 meters here, so well above the 35 feet minimum requirement. In other words, the airplane is climbing out completely safely here. So, that much into the incident and what I would say sounds logical from the first amount of information available. Now, there have been a couple of comments that are rather interesting to have a look at in this relation. So, first of all, if we scroll down a little bit, we can see down here that somebody commented that the crew reported tailwind on rotation, and then the spotter who filmed this says that this amazes him because there was no wind. And I'm pretty sure that at the position where the spotter was located, he wrote in the comments above that he was spotting from Terminal Echo and looking into the chart over here. Terminal Echo is the one located just up here, and he's been looking down the runway like this. So he's been located somewhere over here. I totally trust him that there was no wind at the location where he was actually located, but a little bit further down the runway, there might very well still have been some wind. And remember, we're talking light winds here. We're talking about 4 knots according to the META, with the usual caveat that we mentioned earlier obviously applying. So we are looking at a wind shift of maybe just under 10 knots, but that can be more than sufficient to cause the flight profile we've seen, while it really seems like there is hardly any, if not at the location where the spotter was actually located, no wind at all. So that completely makes sense to me. Now, this basically summarizes my view on the first take of this event. Obviously, it is worth pointing out at this point that the actual investigation might reveal something completely different, but in my opinion, what you see on the video really matches what the pilots described with the tailwind gust hitting the plane. It matches the procedures that are published, and it matches good airmanship as well. So, in my opinion, completely makes sense that what you see is what you get in this case, and no undue conspiracy theories do apply, in my opinion, over here. So, let me know your opinion in the comments below the video, and with all of that, I would like to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, be sure to let me know in the comments below. I see you all again right on the next one, and in the meantime, if you're up for more, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all again on the next one.